When you're collecting retro games, you'll notice some odd things. For example, the cartridges might look a little weird. The Nintendo and the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, most of their games have a pretty uniform look to them. Just looking at the cartridge, you'll be able to know what system it goes for, that sort of thing. Now, the Genesis, they've got a few different ones, though. You'll see the EA Sports. They look very different from the regular Genesis ones, and that's because EA had their own manufacturer. This created a very distinct look that they have, where they've got that little yellow thing on them. At first, I didn't know what it was, but it's just the way they made them. Then you might come across Accolade's. Accolade's cartridges look very similar to what EA's does, except for they don't have the weird little yellow chip on it. They don't really need it, so yeah, they look a little different. And I was wondering why. Why do these Accolade cartridges look different? The easiest thing to say is they had their own manufacturer, which they did. But there's a little bit more to that story. And it has to do with a lawsuit between Accolade and Sega, which was kind of started by Ashido, Way of the Stones. It's a very weird story, but it's not one that's uncommon for, video games. I'm going to move through this as quickly as I can, but I wanted to hit some of the more crucial points. To tell the story of Sega and Accolade, I need to go back to Sega's relationship with EA and some of their other third-party developers. In the late 1980s, Sega was taking another shot at the North American market after pulling out a few times. Previously, they had a manufacturing presence in the early 80s after their acquisition of Gremlin, but that got sold off when they left the North American market following the video game crash. Later, they would try again with Tonka when they released the Master System. That didn't quite pan out, so they tried again in 1989, where they would release the Sega Genesis in North America. Sega would use their catalog of arcade hits as a starting point for their new game library for their system. However, they still needed third-party developers to support their new console. Nintendo had locked up many of those developers with exclusivity deals in North America. So to circumvent this, Sega would license arcade games from developers like Capcom and then port those games to their new system. They also leaned on licensing deals for sports stars in order to gain some attention, like Buster Douglas. They also had Walter Payton at one point. Then they got Joe Montana. This is where EA kind of enters the scene. Both EA and Accolade were primarily publishers for PC games. Both wanted to get their games on the home console. Both companies would end up reverse engineering the Sega Genesis because they didn't want to pay licensing fees for third-party developers on the system. The difference is how Sega approached both of them. EA was able to cut a deal, and they brought over a bunch of games to the Sega Genesis. They also got a better deal where they could release more games, they could do their own manufacturing to lower their own costs, and they didn't have to pay Sega as much. Accolade would also cut a deal, but that would come much later on. First, they basically told Sega to pound sand, and they decided to do it their own way. So they reversed engineered the Sega Genesis, they reversed engineered several of the cartridges, but they did something similar to what Tengen did on the NES, where they copied too much code when they decided to make their own cartridges. This is what led to a lawsuit between the two companies, but we'll get into that in a minute. So let's talk about Accolade really quick. They were started in 1984, and they were basically formed by former Atari employees as well as Activision employees. It is a fascinating story of just how all these different software companies can trace their roots back to Atari. It feels a little bit like a weird game of 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Anyway, Accolade made a bunch of well-remembered series, or at least series that people know about. Some of them are probably better remembered than others. Star Control is probably a much more, not really recognizable, but a much more loved series than Bubsy is. Deadlock was another series that they came up with, as well as Test Drive, Hardball, and the Jack Nicklaus golf games. I wouldn't necessarily call these world beaters, but at least they were games that some people remember. They were able to get licenses from some sports stars like Jack Nicklaus, and they at least tried. They did fairly well, and they were able to last for a very long time doing what they did. Accolade was focused on making games for the home computer, like the Commodore 64, as well as other home computers. They were a publisher and a developer at the time, similar to what Sierra Online was doing. They initially found success with sports games, and in the late 1980s, they branched out into strategy and simulation games. In the early 1990s, they wanted to make games for a revived home console market, and yeah, they did a pretty good job of circumventing Sega's lockout technology. This is how we get to the Sega v. Accolade lawsuit, and the weirdness that was involved in that, because Sega wasn't suing them over, stealing their code or anything like that. They were actually suing them over copyright infringement. Of all the games to start a lawsuit between two companies, ours begins with Ishido Way of the Stones. It is a puzzle game, and a game that I probably never would have talked about unless I started doing research on this lawsuit, because there's not really too much to it. It's just one of those odd moments in video game history where something like this creates an issue between two companies. What Sega wanted was to be the exclusive publisher of Accolade's games. This would prevent them from putting their games out on the Super Nintendo. However, Accolade chose to reverse engineer Sega's code by getting several of their games, and then they just started releasing games on their own. Sega decided to change that, and they decided to put some different coding into their systems, basically a lockout technology, similar to the NES when they had their own lockout chip, and Tengen would steal the code and then basically release games. Accolade didn't steal anything, they just reverse engineered too much and then used too much of the code. In 1990, Sega created something called the Trademark Security System, or TMSS. This would display the message produced by, on, under, license from Sega Enterprise Ltd. That is how it was written. I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's a very confusing thing, and this is like the fifth take that I've had from trying to say this the way it was written. This forced Sega's trademark to be displayed on the games when it powered up. That nice Sega logo that popped up, that was actually programmed into their system. So Accolade went back to the drawing board because what they did with Ishido Way of the Stones was no longer going to work on their next games. So they reverse engineered the code again, discovered the TMSS code, and put that into their new games that they were going to release. This caused Sega to file a lawsuit against them for copyright infringement in 1991. Sega initially won an injunction against Accolade in 1992 that would prevent Accolade from selling their games. However, Accolade would appeal this decision. Later in 1992, Accolade filed their appeal. Their injunction remained in effect until August of 1992. The injunction was reversed. Accolade had argued that they had reversed engineered the code in a case of fair use, and the court reviewed 4 criteria for fair use: the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount of copyrighted work used, the purpose of the use, and the effect of the use on the market. Sega tried to use a sweat of the brow argument against Accolade's fair use claims. This was rejected based on several previous legal precedent. The court ruled that where disassembly is the only way to gain access to the ideas and functional elements, like software programs or computer programs, disassembly is a fair use of the copyrighted work, and basically saying you worked really hard on it isn't a good defense against that. Unfortunately, this didn't end the case because Accolade was still in some ways being kept out of the market. Sega had petitioned the court to rehear the case, but things would end up getting settled out of court, and Accolade would eventually become a Sega licensee. They just kept doing what they were doing before with their manufacturing agreements. So let's talk a little bit about the fallout of all this. This case was settled out of court. Accolade would become a Sega licensee, but the lawsuit's financial ramifications would be felt for the rest of Accolade's existence. While they didn't lose the case, the initial injunction hurt them financially. In January 1993, the court lifted the injunction against Accolade, allowing them to sell games again. However, Accolade had lost somewhere between $15 and $25 million, depending on the source that you use. I've seen a few of them at this point. Accolade and Sega would settle their case in April of 1993. The terms of the settlement weren't released to the public. If they got some special agreement from Sega, like EA did, that wasn't really made known. It seems that no one has really dug into this, or at least I wasn't able to find anything that's sort of tells what happened. The EA deal is a little bit more well known, or at least better covered, and much better researched. Accolade continued to release games until it was bought by Infogrames in 1999. They put a lot of effort into Deadlock and Star Control 3, but that just couldn't keep the company afloat. Accolade as a company was essentially gone in 1999. Infogrames would buy Atari, in 2001, and then would later go bankrupt. In 2013, Tomo acquired the Accolade trademark. In 2017, Billionsoft bought Accolade and some of its assets, along with Black Forest Games. They would end up releasing new Bubsy games, because the world apparently needed more of that. In 2023, Atari would acquire the rights to Accolade and several of its properties. I think I've got all that straight. It's a very long and somewhat confusing thing in order to get here. Sega would be fine. I think pretty much everybody knows what their history was. They would leave the home console market, and now they're just a software publisher and developer. The case did establish some precedents regarding what can and can't be protected by copyright, so that's kind of interesting. When I was a kid, and somewhat stupider than I am now, I always thought that the EA cartridges had some kind of a memory expansion to them, and that's why they looked the way that they did. I had absolutely no reason to think that that was true, but that was my explanation for it. All my friends seemed to have thought the same way, if they even thought about it at all. Yeah, I probably would have thought something similar if I had ever seen an Accolade cartridge out in the wild, but I don't ever remember seeing one when I was a kid. After looking into this, I find it really interesting. The story of third-party developers on the Sega Genesis and just how these unlicensed games came to be is kind of amazing. It seems like Sega had a problem similar to what Atari's was. If you had the money and the time, you could reverse engineer their console and you could make games for it, much like you could do with the Atari 2600. Seeing how companies in the US lead back to Atari is always interesting to me. It seems like whenever I dig into one of these companies, at some point it loops back to Atari in some way. I really wasn't expecting this case to be about fair use. I would have thought it would have been about them getting the code in some way, but no, it's all about a trademark and a logo. That's kind of fun. It's a little different. Anyway, I'm not sure what I'm going to be looking into next for a project. I still have a few others to record, so I'm not sure what's next. Anyway, I'll talk to you all later. Bye.